Hello. I think it's funny that my talk is in the middle of a session called From Chips to Product, to borrow I guess a rock pun from the first presentation. Sometimes between chips and product, IP will tear us apart. Of course, licenses are a tool that we use to try to stop IP from tearing us apart in that process. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some recent developments in Creative Commons licenses that are pertinent to open hardware, but the underlying theme I want to get at is really moving the community's focus from thinking about policy in terms of individual and project license choice to public policy. And I really think that Joshua Pierce's presentation was an awesome example of that earlier. I believe he mentioned using an open viral license once, but at the close of his presentation, he had several slides on the public policy changes needed to make open hardware and open science the default. Production note, I noticed looking for imagery for this presentation that the flag of Philadelphia could be interpreted as a flag for open hardware. I decided to improve that a little bit. I put a blue LED on the shield. And so that's your remix slide for a Creative Commons talk. I'm sure that many of you can do better. I also said that I would dedicate this talk to colleague Basil Kartabil, who's a Syrian political prisoner since 2012. He's a founder of Creative Commons Syria. This is a scene from Creative Commons Global Summit in 2013 calling for his release. He's really at risk. His prison is actually on the front lines being contested by the Syrian army and the Army of Islam right now. All we can really do is raise visibility, so I encourage you to look up Free Basil. I'm also going to use Basil as a prop here. Basil kind of got involved in open stuff at a time and is of a temperament that he sees value in openness across a bunch of different fields. And I really think that open hardware is the kind of meta movement where all of the different opens are coming together. It's really the most eclectic. And you can see that in a bunch of presentations earlier today about education and science. And one of the ways that that eclecticism plays out is that open hardware uses licenses associated with a bunch of other fields. This is a survey from 2013, but from my experience, license change happens very slowly as projects start and die. So it's probably still fairly accurate. But the thing to note here is that there are licenses that are more typically associated with content or software, and there's one specifically open hardware license here. So I want to talk about the way that I frame licenses. One, you can think of them as offering permissions. They're deregulatory if you want to think about it and kind of extrapolate to public policy terms. And they also have conditions, which you can think of as being regulatory in public policy terms. Now, the permissions are actually really necessary to create a low-risk environment for open collaboration, and they're relatively straightforward. Conditions are what basically everybody likes to argue about, and they're not very straightforward and are the cause of most of the problems with incompatibility. And one kind of ironic incompatibility problem is multiple copyleft licenses that are not compatible with each other. In other words, you have two works, one under CC by SA, for example, another under the GPL or the CERN OHL. You can't combine them because of this incompatibility. But so that's a major problem with licenses, but a much bigger problem is actually people who don't use licenses at all. You can see the most frequent response to this survey was, I've released files without an explicit license, which means there's no permission, there's no attempt to create a risk-free environment for open collaboration. However, there's a much, much bigger problem, and that is that most hardware designs and designers don't see themselves as being part of the open hardware movement, maybe don't even have any conception of it. So I'd like to keep that last problem in mind if you're tempted to debate, put licenses against each other. Really, the problem is that the open hardware movement needs to get much, much bigger. It's still worth thinking about how to make licenses work better, and I'll talk a bit about that, but it's really necessary, coming back to that theme I mentioned at the beginning, to look beyond private application of licenses to public policy. So there are several things that I think somebody developing a new license version or a new license ought to consider if the goal is to in general, improve the commons. And I won't go into details on these for time's sake, but I encourage you to look at my slides. One is differentiation, so basically add something new to the ecosystem. Do you grant necessary permissions? I think this has been inadequately looked at for open hardware because people are really excited about enforceability, which is the condition side of it. But in order to create a low-risk environment for collaboration, getting all of the permissions solid is the most important thing. And then there's the conditions or regulation side of it. And I really want people to think about how the licenses, which are private instruments, how they prototype public policy. Then a new license or new license version should, at worst, not decrease compatibility, should not introduce new compatibility problems, and preferably should increase interoperability. And I'd like to see more cross-domain thinking in licenses as opposed to licenses developed in the silo of open data or open source software or even open source hardware. I think one of the big problems is there's not a lot of sharing of knowledge because there aren't enough people like Basil who are really involved in everything. And basically reinventing tools and practices that have already been trialed out, especially in software. So one example of a new license version is Creative Commons version 4.0. This is a visual representation, or actually a screen capture, comparing version 3.0 Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike and version 4.0. There are a bunch of improvements in 4.0. Overall, it's easier to understand, easier to comply with, more global. I think you can kind of see that easier to understand on the previous slide. You can see there's a lot more obvious structure in the 4.0, a lot less big blobs of paragraphs of legal text. I want to talk about two particular changes of interest to open source hardware. One is the compatibility mechanism, which reduces that incompatibility problem that I highlighted before. And this is the quote from the license that shows the actual legal text that accomplishes that. And we have Creative Commons has a process by which it can declare other licenses either one-way or two-way compatible with CC by SA. And that process existed before, but it was never actually used because it was too narrow. And so we actually have declared compatibility with one other copyleft license so far, the FreeArt license. It's probably not particularly interesting to the open hardware community, but it's kind of proof that this mechanism really does work. We're, I think, very close to this becoming reality that CC by SA will be unilaterally or donor compatible with GPL v3. That means that you'll be able to take a CC by SA project, adapt it or combine it with a project under the GPL, and release the derivative work, so the derivative design, for example, under the GPL. That really mitigates one of the big incompatibility problems. So you see I'm reproducing that survey results with the incompatibility between GPL and CC by SA greatly lightened. There's another development in CC version 4.0, both CC by and by SA, which are both sometimes used for open hardware, and that is that patent grants is explicitly excluded. One was never actually explicitly included, but explicit exclusion it clarifies things, but it also really highlights that open hardware projects that have any concern about patents and want to make sure that collaborators aren't collaborating in bad spirit because they hold patents that they could use to tax everybody later on, means that you need to think about other approaches. One, of course, is moving to a license that has a patent grant in it. GPL v3 is one, and if we get compatibility, that will help there. If you're more into permissive licenses, then Apache is one of those. There are also other sort of external to the license mechanisms you can use that imitate what happens in standards bodies. There are also patent-focused tools that are complementary to open licenses. Defensive patent license is one. It's really a patent club. Because of the way it's structured, it's complementary, not a replacement. You can read my analysis of it if you're interested in the details. So I want to get to the public policy side of this. These images are all things that are highly regulated, of great public interest, vulnerable to both criminals and states and vendor lock-in, and their hardware designs matter as well as their software, as well as the openness of their software and data. Now, I want to suggest that open source hardware might offer a lightweight regulatory framework that encourages innovation and discourages both regulatory capture and capture by proprietary interests. And that's the direction, that's a very important direction that the open hardware movement ought to be focusing its kind of political and policy efforts. So there are several paths that you can take from licenses to public policy. You can think of as licenses being a way to do that at the individual level. You're setting your individual IP policy, but it can be done at an organizational or for a field that has a dominant funder to actually changing the law at the government levels. I put these into a few different categories. One is that the entity actually creating the works stipulates an open IP policy. Another one is that the funder stipulates it. Another is basically a demand side thing that the entity using or procuring whatever the thing is mandates that it's open. And then there's actually changing the law either by liberalizing the law or changing regulations. And I want to encourage people interested in pursuing openness as a policy matter to think about how public policy can specifically benefit the open hardware ecosystem, not just generic patent or copyright reform, which there's a huge hurdle for and is always ends up in the favor of huge industries. So I just want to highlight a couple of things that Creative Commons has done that are in the vein of moving from licenses to public policy. This is for educational materials and scientific publication. Basically, they primarily fall into the funder side of this, mandates that stuff that's publicly funded be published under public license so that everybody can have use for it, which also has important distributional effects. So the thing I want to leave you with is that open licenses prototype open public policy and think about what this means and how to implement that in the context of open source hardware. Oh, and also Creative Commons is having another global summit, and I'm sure there will be another scene urging the release of Basel, but it's in Seoul next month, and there will be a couple of sessions on open hardware, so I encourage you to check that out. And here are some links. Thank you very much.